Hello there everybody, Sam's Trains here and welcome back to the Railway. Today I'm talking about weird and wonderful experimental steam locomotives. This is an absolutely typical steam locomotive. It follows all of the norms of a standard steam locomotive design. All of the bits are in the right places. It has a cab at the rear behind the firebox, which contains the fire. In front of this is the boiler where the water is heated, of course, and at the very front is the familiar smoke box where all of the exhaust gases go. It has horizontally mounted cylinders which drive multiple sets of coupled wheels using coupling rods. The cylinders are timed using this Walschaerts valve gear, which is probably the most common valve gear on British steam locomotives. Over the years though, many steam locomotive designers decided to deviate from these standard designs, which produced some very interesting results. Now, some of these experiments failed outright. Others didn't fail per se, but they did fail to catch on. So today we're going to be talking about some of these experimental steam locomotives, and if they did fail, we'll talk about why they failed. So the first locomotive up today is this. This is Locomotion No. 1, and this one was experimental in that it was built before all of the norms of a steam locomotive had chance to become established. She was built exactly 200 years ago this year, in 1825, by Robert Stephenson. And this came from a time when the steam locomotive was very much still being invented. So it has no cab at the rear, it's just got a firebox allowing a fireman to fuel the locomotive. Instead, the driver would actually stand on these boards at the side of the engine to operate the cylinders, which seems like a very precarious place to stand among these powerfully moving rods, plus there's the danger of falling off the side, of course. The cylinders are mounted vertically, not horizontally, and that's a practice that was soon abandoned in the years to come. And clearly, this is not Walschaerts valve gear. This is a far more primitive valve gear, and it required a driver to set the valve gear in motion initially using these levers. So why did this design fail? Why didn't future steam locomotives just look like larger versions of this? Well, first of all, it literally failed. In 1828, the locomotive exploded and actually killed its driver, which is far from ideal. Now, you might assume that this locomotive was just so primitive that it didn't have a safety valve, perhaps. A safety valve is a device that relieves the pressure in a boiler if it reaches dangerous levels. But no, it did have a safety valve. The driver just tied the arm of the safety valve down to stop it working, presumably to try and get higher boiler pressure. So I guess technically this didn't explode because of how primitive it was, but perhaps it was a mistake to design a safety valve that was so easy to sabotage like that. And obviously there was a bit of a skill issue with the driver there. Nobody in their right minds today, knowing what they know about the steam locomotive, would tie down a safety valve like that. But again, steam locomotives were a pretty new technology back then. Presumably the dangers weren't appreciated as much as they are today. Other issues with this though included the inefficient boiler design, which was improved with later locomotives. The vertical cylinders and drive system was apparently inefficient as well, producing a relatively weak locomotive with limited speed and haulage capacity. And of course, these were all things that were vastly improved as the steam locomotive developed. Now then, we're going to fast forward nearly 80 years to 1903, and by this time obviously the steam locomotive was far more refined than Locomotion No. 1 was, but that isn't to say that the formula wasn't experimented on. The next locomotive we're looking at is this. This is known as the Great Western Steam Railmotor, and it was designed for the Great Western Railway by George Jackson Churchward. The basic premise of this was to combine a steam locomotive with a passenger carriage to produce a low-cost and highly efficient passenger carrying vehicle for branch lines or lines with low demand. To do this, they installed a literal steam locomotive where one of the coach's bogies would be, to create an entirely self-contained train, a bit like the diesel multiple units that would become the norm in the years to come. Unlike typical steam locomotives with a cab at the rear, the Railmotors had cabs at either end with controls hooked up to the steam locomotive, allowing it to be controlled remotely. Now that was an innovative design. Now, in many ways, the Railmotor was not a design failure. It did work, and in fact, speaking of the Great Western one specifically, almost 100 of these things were built in total. But the design did not catch on. Eventually, these Railmotors were rebuilt into more typical coaches known as auto coaches. An auto coach used many of the same design features, i.e. a cab allowing the steam locomotive to be controlled remotely, but the locomotive was separated from the coach, as is more usual. So what was wrong with having a steam locomotive incorporated as part of a coach? Well, the coach had to be taken out of service while the engine was undergoing maintenance, which wasn't ideal. The locomotives also had to be very small and light in order to fit into the confines of a coach, which limited their power. In fact, when fully loaded, or perhaps when hauling an additional coach, these things would have to stop during their journeys to build up enough steam to continue. That doesn't sound dreadfully efficient to me. Finally, steam locomotives are filthy, and it was pretty difficult to keep the dirt and the oil and the smoke away from the passenger compartment. So all in all, this unfortunately was a pretty impractical idea, which did work for a time, but it didn't stand the test of time. Cool idea though, I do enjoy the Railmotors. The next locomotive then, I'm not convinced is strictly experimental. However, it is extremely unconventional, which is why I've used it in this video, and it's also fair to say that this locomotive design didn't catch on to become the norm, and we'll talk about why that is. But locomotive number 3 is this. This is known as the Steam Sentinel. These Sentinels were built in 1925, and despite technically being tank engines, as you can see, this looks nothing like your typical tank engine. It's got a small vertical boiler rather than a horizontal one, and this is encased by a large cab, as you can see, which hides most of the usual parts of a steam locomotive from view. This also uses chains to drive the wheels rather than coupling rods, which again is quite rare for a steam locomotive, I think. Now, to be fair to these locomotives, as far as I can tell, for low-speed shunting work, let's say, there was not much wrong with these. They did the job pretty well. However, there is a reason why, let's say, an express passenger steam locomotive was not designed like this engine. Vertical boilers like this are generally less efficient than horizontal ones. And can you imagine if they tried to mount a boiler the size of, let's say, a Princess Royal's boiler vertically? Yeah, that thing would tower about 4 stories up into the air. You could possibly argue that that's a little bit impractical or possibly dangerous. So this is really only a design that works for very small, light and weak locomotives. Also, having most of the mechanism encased inside the cab like this made maintenance a little bit more tricky. The small size of the engines also limited their water and coal capacity, making them unsuitable for long distance journeys. These chain drives were also less robust than coupling rods. A chain is made up of many links and therefore consists of countless moving parts, which have a possibility of failing. Chains can also stretch over time, which is not something I necessarily realised, but they can, depending on temperature and wear, they can change length, making them less effective at what they do. If you compare this to a standard coupling rod, which is literally just a rod which goes round and round, this is a much simpler system, so for larger, faster locomotives, you don't really want to be using chains, and more on this later on. Finally, by the 1920s and 1930s, it was frankly becoming more efficient to make small locomotives like this diesel-powered. Steam was complicated and expensive, and the diesel engine was getting better and cheaper all the time. And as such, there just aren't that many classes of steam locomotive, at least not shunting locomotives, that are built like this. The next locomotive is one of my favourite experiments. It is this. It's known as William Stanier's Turbomotive, and it was built for the LMS in 1935. Now, at first glance, this does look like a fairly standard steam locomotive. All the bits are in the right place after all, such as the cab at the back, followed by the boiler and the firebox, but on closer inspection you can see that the cylinders and also the valve gear are completely missing. Now, some locomotives hide these cylinders and valve gear between the frames out of sight, but that's not what's happened here. This locomotive does not have any cylinders or any valve gear. It was driven by a steam turbine. Now, a steam turbine works similar to a wind turbine, except of course they're obviously much smaller, faster, and turned by pressurized steam instead of wind. Now, this design actually had a lot of advantages. Apparently at speed, a steam turbine was extremely efficient, and it also produced a much smoother power output than cylinders did. Obviously, cylinders are constantly going forwards and backwards, changing direction, not so with a turbine. They produce a smooth and constant power output. The lack of valve gear also meant a lack of moving parts, which made maintenance much simpler. And because turbines are so efficient at high speed, that was absolutely perfect for an express passenger locomotive, which would spend most of the time at high speed. So this all sounds fantastic on paper, but surprisingly, Turbomotive was the only one of her kind built. Nothing else was ever created quite like this, at least not by Stania and the LMS, and Turbomotive herself was eventually rebuilt into a standard locomotive, foregoing the turbine, which was replaced with traditional cylinders and even Walschaerts valve gear. So what on earth went wrong with this thing? Well, first of all, while the engine was very efficient at high speed, that wasn't the case at lower speeds, meaning steam turbines probably wouldn't have been suitable for local passenger work or shunting, for example, which would require near constant starting and stopping. Turbomotive was only powerful in the forwards direction too. Steam cylinders can drive a normal locomotive in either direction with equal power, but turbines don't work like that. So a smaller separate turbine was needed for Turbomotive to run in reverse, and because this was much smaller and weaker than the main turbine, the locomotive itself was far weaker and slower in reverse. Again, this was fine for an express passenger locomotive, but this would have been a major disadvantage for other types of engine. And finally, locomotive builders and operators were just too stuck in their ways to accept a new technology like this. Every locomotive just ran on cylinders. Everybody understood how cylinders worked, they understood how to build locomotives with cylinders and valve gear, they understood how to maintain and repair them. And because the cylinder technology was so common, parts were cheap and readily available. Not the case with turbines. In 1949, the main turbine failed in Turbomotive, and because steam turbines were so obscure, it would have cost an absolute fortune to fix this. And so the design was abandoned, and as you know, this loco was just rebuilt into a standard steam locomotive, and as such, no more steam turbines were built for the LMS, and as far as I know, no steam turbines were built for any of the other railways either. So a cool idea, but ultimately cylinder technology was too far along, and so this experiment failed. Up next then, we have one of my absolute favourite experimental steam locomotives, and that is this. This is the Southern Railway's Battle of Britain or West Country class, which was introduced to the design of Oliver Bulleid in 1945. Now, these locomotives may look very unusual, but most of that is an illusion. At heart, these locomotives were fairly traditional. For instance, they still had the normal cab, boiler and smoke box in the usual places as well. It's just that these were hidden underneath this air-smoothed casing, which made the locomotives easier to wash. Bulleid also liked to use these Firth Brown wheels instead of regular spoked wheels because they were cheaper to make and stronger than normal wheels too, with less chance of warping. But they're still wheels at the end of the day. These engines even had traditional cylinders, which drove the wheels via coupling and connecting rods in the usual way. So nothing too strange here. The only truly experimental part of these locomotives would be the valve gear, which was hidden away between the frames. This valve gear would be contained in a sealed oil bath between the frames, which protected it from the elements. Remember, traditional valve gear sits outside the frames, where it's fairly exposed. The chain-driven system was also a compact system which required less room than Walschaerts valve gear, and apparently it also produced a smoother ride. But because it was sealed in a bath of oil for lubrication, it was extremely inconvenient to access if anything went wrong. And Unfortunately for the Southern Railway and for Oliver Bulleid, quite a lot did go wrong with this. There was an issue where the chains would stretch over time, which led to poor valve timing, stopping the locomotive working properly, so the entire mechanism had to be opened up every 30,000 miles or so that new chains could be fitted. Yeah, that's not ideal, is it? And to add insult to injury, the oil baths would often crack and leak oil everywhere. Plus, of course, it was just very expensive to maintain this because it was a unique design which didn't share components with other locomotives with traditional valve gear. So all in all, this design actually worked well, but only when it was working well. Unfortunately, it was a very, very complex design which was riddled with quite a few issues. Yet, despite the complication, the performance was said to be not really much better, if at all, than a locomotive with traditional Walschaerts valve gear. So, as a result, British Railways eventually rebuilt the entire class to feature traditional Walschaerts valve gear from 1957 onwards. They also did this with Bulleid's other chain-driven locomotive, the Merchant Navy class, and this design was not attempted on any other steam locomotives, except for one, and that is the last locomotive in today's video. That is, of course, the Bulleid Leader class. This, I think, is the oddest locomotive in today's video, and it's the engine that deviates the most from this standard steam locomotive design. This was another locomotive built to the design of Oliver Bulleid, this time in 1946, and this loco was completely unique. And on paper, I think this was a really clever design, and it really had the potential to revolutionise the steam locomotive as we know it. A bit like the Railmotor, the Leader had a cab at either end, allowing the engine to be driven in either direction with excellent visibility, a bit like a diesel. The boiler and firebox, etc. was placed between the two cabs and was surrounded by this casing, again making the engine more convenient to clean and wash. Then, instead of the small number of driving wheels we see on normal locomotives, typically around 6 wheels, the Leader had double that with 12 driven wheels, separated onto 2 bogies with 3 driven axles on each. This would spread the load of the locomotive over a much wider area, which was advantageous because it reduced the wear on the track, and because of the lack of non-driven bogie or pony wheels, every ounce of the locomotive was supported by driving wheels, thus maximising traction. The valve gear was based on the chain-driven valve gear from Bulleid Pacifics though, so you can imagine how that went. Generally though, this was a really smart design which, like I say, could have revolutionised the steam locomotive, except it didn't. It consumed quite a lot more coal and water than traditional locomotives did, and it was also unreliable. The fire bricks in the firebox kept collapsing into the fire, and when replaced with cast iron, that melted away into the fire. Conditions were also terrible for firemen and drivers too, with flames entering the cab causing unbearable heat. Plus, the firemen would apparently have to work extremely hard to maintain the locomotive's excessive coal consumption. The engine was also unbalanced. It wanted to lean to one side, much like the KR Models model of the Bulleid Leader, except that was leaning to one side because one of its wheels was loose. But in real life, it really did lean to one side, which caused uneven loading on the bogies. All in all then, while this locomotive did work well at times, it was also an extremely radical locomotive, totally different from everything else that existed. And so if it was going to be accepted by the powers that be, if more like this were going to be built, then this loco had to be perfect. It had to set the perfect example, with no problems whatsoever. And sadly, that just wasn't the case. There were too many troubles, and the locomotive, really unfortunately, was cut up and scrapped, despite many aspects of the design being really forward-thinking and innovative. And even worse than that, the other members of the class which had been started were aborted before they could be finished. And here ends the most interesting, I think, of the experimental steam locomotive stories. But anyway, those are 6 experimental steam locomotives that I find really interesting. Of course, there were more than just 6 experimental locomotives out there. So what are your favourite experimental steam locomotives? Are there any that you don't think I've heard of that I'd be interested to read about? If so, please do comment down below. For now though, I think I will leave that video there, so thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you for another video very, very soon. Alright, cheers folks, you take care.